An uncertain throne. Hebrews 1:8 is one of those verses where the characteristics of Greek grammar and the tendencies of Greek style give the translator a big headache. In this verse, we have a sentence without verbs. When I am grading my students' papers, this is a mistake I frequently must correct. I tell them, a sentence must have a verb. So how can I admit to them that the Bible has many sentences without verbs? Thankfully, the Bible was composed not in English but in Greek, and this makes all the difference. In Greek, the verb often is omitted as unnecessary. There are other elements in a Greek sentence, such as noun cases, that usually allow the sentence to be understood even without a simple verb like is. Since it is implied, it does not need to be said explicitly. When we translate from Greek into English, however, we supply the implied verb, because English is the kind of language where the verb must be there to help put the sentence together. So far, so good. The problem in Hebrews 1:8 is that we are not sure where the verb is belongs in the sentence, and where it belongs makes a big difference in the meaning of the verse. Take a look at the passage in a lexical interlinear translation. Ho thronos su ho theos eis ton aiona. Tu aionos, the throne of you, the God, until the age of the age. Let's start to put this sentence together. The throne of you means your throne. The God is the way the Bible indicates God. The definite article makes it specifically the one God. Until the age of the age is the typical biblical way to say forever and ever. Now the question is, where does the verb is go in this sense to hold it all together in a coherent statement? In English, we know exactly where to place a verb. It goes between the subject and the object of the verb, or in sentences that use the verb to be, between the subject and the predicate noun or predicate adjective, or some other predicate modifier. The question in Hebrews 1:8 is, what is the subject? Subject nouns in Greek are usually easy to identify because they are in the subject nominative form, or case. But when the verb is a be verb, the other nouns in the sentence can also be in the nominative form. In Hebrews 1:8, we have two nouns in the nominative form, throne and God. The verb is might go between these two nouns, as it does in dozens of cases of saying X is Y in the New Testament. If that is so, then the sentence reads, your throne is God, forever and ever. This is the way the sentence is read by the translators of the NW. The NRSV and TFE translators also recognize this as a possible translation of this verse, and so include it in a footnote in their respective translations. But there is another possible way to translate Hebrews 1:8. The phrase ho theos is sometimes used to say O God in Greek. In other words, even though the form in which this phrase appears normally and usually marks it as the subject under discussion God, it can also be used for direct address to the subject, O God. As Greek spread throughout the ancient world and simplified into common Koine Greek, some very specialized forms of speech dropped out of the language, and more commonly used forms took on more and more work. This happened with the form of speech used in Greek for direct address, tell me John. If you compare in an interlinear Bible Jesus' cry from the cross in Matthew 7:46 to the same event in Mark 15:34, you will see that Matthew has Jesus address God in the classy Greek way thee, while Mark uses the common man's language, ho theos. This same substitution of the subject nominative form of the noun God, ho theos, for the direct address vocative form thee occurs just 3 other times in the New Testament, in Luke 18:11, Luke 18:13, and significantly Hebrews 10:7. In the latter verse, a quote from Psalm 40 includes the following clause, I have come to do your will, O God. In this verse, O God translates ho theos. So it is obvious that the author of this book of the Bible can use ho theos to mean O God. At the same time, the same author uses ho theos dozens of times to mean God. The usual meaning of the phrase. These facts make it very hard for us to know which way to translate this phrase in Hebrews 1:8. Since there are a handful of instances in the New Testament where ho theos means O God, rather than God, it is possible that in Hebrews 1:8 ho theos means O God. But since ho theos usually means God, and there are hundreds of examples of this, it is more probable that in Hebrews 1:8 ho theos means God. But the translators of most of the versions we are comparing have chosen the rarer, less probable way to translate ho theos. By taking it to mean O God, and by putting is after the two nouns throne and God, and before the prepositional phrase forever and ever, they read the verse as, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The KJV, NASB, NIV, NAB, ABI, and LB choose to translate this way, and do not alert their readers to the uncertainties of the passage. The NRSV and TEV also put this translation into their text, while, as I mentioned, pointing out the translation options in a footnote. In my opinion, the NRSV, TEV, and NW have done the right thing by informing their readers that there are two ways the verse can and has been translated. Both translations are possible, so none of the translations we are comparing can be rejected as inaccurate. We cannot settle the debate with certainty. But which translation is more probable? First, on the basis of linguistics, Ho Theos is more likely to mean God, as it does hundreds of times throughout the New Testament, than O God, a meaning it has in only 3 other places in the New Testament. Furthermore, there is no other example in the Bible where the expression forever stands alone as a predicate phrase with the verb to be, as it would if the sentence were read, "Your throne is forever." Forever always functions as a phrase complementing either an action verb or a predicate noun or pronoun. Moreover, there is no other way to say God is your throne than the way Hebrews 1:8 reads. There is, however, another way to say your throne, O God, namely by using the direct address vocative form thee rather than the subject nominative form Ho Theos. The test of asking, is there some other way the author could have expressed X if he or she meant X, is an important one in translation and interpretation. Second, on the basis of literary context, we can say that Jesus, who is the subject being discussed in Hebrews 1:8, is not called God anywhere else in the epistle to the Hebrews. In the immediate context of Hebrews 1:7-9, the author is making a contrast between angels and Jesus. Quotes from the Old Testament are used to make this contrast. Verse 7, quoting Psalm 104:4, shows that God talks about the angels as servants. The contrast is made in verse 8, which says, "But God says about the Son," and then quotes the words we are trying to figure out from Psalm 45:6-7. In contrast to the angels who serve, the Son is enthroned. But is God the throne on which the Son rests, or is the Son himself called God here? Fortunately, there is another literary context to help us, namely the original psalm that is being quoted in Hebrews 1:8. Psalm 45 is a hymn in praise of the King of Israel. God is addressed nowhere in this psalm. Instead, we get a lengthy description of the king's ideal life. He is described as shooting arrows girded with a sword, perfumed, living in ivory-embellished palaces, entertained with lutes, attended by fair princesses, and aroused by their beauty. Can there be any doubt that the life described here is of a very human king? So what does it have to do with Jesus, and why is it quoted as if it is about Jesus? It's really quite simple. Jesus is the Messiah. The Messiah is the rightful king of Israel. What is said about the king of Israel can be said equally of the Messiah. In fact, the ideal life described here is quite mundane, but not boring. Terms is stated to be the reward given to the king because you have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, the psalm continues, God has anointed you with the oil of gladness more than your companions. The psalm is about what God has done for the person spoken to. Within the Jewish tradition, Psalm 45 has never been taken to call King God. The modern translation published by the Jewish Bible Society reads, Your divine throne is everlasting. The Greek translation of the psalm made before the beginning of Christianity, which reads exactly as the author of Hebrews has quoted it, certainly followed this traditional Jewish understanding of the verse. And its translators thought that by using Ho Theos they were saying God is your throne, not your throne, O God. It is always possible that the author of Hebrews understood it differently. There are other examples in Hebrews where Old Testament verses are reinterpreted. But these reinterpretations are always made apparent to the reader by slight changes in how the verses are quoted. In Hebrews 2:6-8. In Hebrews 1:8, the author would have to make some change in phrasing to make the reinterpretation explicit. But no change is made. So even if the author understood Ho Theos here as direct address, he or she has not left us any explicit indication of that. So we must conclude that the more probable translation is, God is your throne. The translation found in the NW and in the footnotes of the NRSV and TEV. 3 giants of modern New Testament scholarship, Westcott, Moffatt, and Goodspeed, came to the same conclusion independently. The fact is, if this verse were quoted in the New Testament in reference to anyone else, the translators would have not hesitated to translate it as God is your throne. It seems likely that it is only because most translations were made by people who already believed that Jesus is God that the less probable way of translating this verse has been preferred. I'm not criticizing their belief. Lamb merely pointing out that such a belief can lead to bias in the choices people make as translators. The issue for the translator is not whether or not Jesus is God, it is whether or not Jesus is called God in this biblical passage. Let me repeat that both ways of translating Hebrews 1:8 are legitimate readings of the original Greek of the verse. There is no basis for proponents of either translation to claim that the other translation is certainly wrong. All that can be discussed is which translation is more probable. When the means we have at our disposal, language, context, environment, cannot settle a translation question with certainty, we have to admit to our readers that our choice is based on other factors. Translators should choose the translation they prefer and provide their readers with a note explaining the uncertainty, as well as the reasons for their preference. Notes. 1. It should be noted that the author of Hebrews is familiar with and does use vocative forms of nouns, such as Kyrie, O Lord, just 2 verses later in 1:10. So he or she could have used a vocative form of God in 1:8 to make direct address perfectly clear, if that is what was intended. Rolf Feruli, in his book The Role of Theology and Bias in Bible Translation, reaches the same conclusion. Thus, in this passage, the theology of the translator is the decisive factor in the translation. Feruli, page 47.